So imagine two friends sitting in, like, the exact same community.
Right, embedded in the exact same day-to-day reality.
Yeah, exactly. They are looking at the exact same data, the same societal structures, the same unfolding events.
But their minds are operating on two completely different frequencies.
Completely different. One of them is deeply, almost painstakingly committed to a rational system.
Right.
He's looking at the world through this lens of, well, cause and effect. Accountability, the idea that actions have inevitable structural consequences.
He's essentially the guy tracking the ledger.
Exactly. He's tracking the ledger. And the other friend is a cynic.
A very persuasive cynic.
Oh, highly persuasive, charismatic, and he constantly ridicules this rational friend. He, leans back, probably laughing, and asks, do you really believe in this?
Do you honestly think this whole system of cause and effect is real?
This rational ledger you're obsessed with, is it actually real? And then, well, fast forward. We hit this massive bifurcation point in the future.
The dust has settled entirely.
Right. And the reasoning mind, the one who tracked the ledger, is sitting in a perfectly functioning, incredibly successful, egalitarian society. He is totally undeniably vindicated.
The ultimate I told you so moment.
The ultimate. And he looks around at his new companions, gestures back to the past, and says, I used to have a friend who mocked all of this.
It's such an arresting image to open with, honestly.
It is.
Largely because it strips away all the abstraction. It grounds this massive concept of civilization collapse right into an interpersonal relationship.
Which makes it so relatable.
Yeah. And, well, we are looking at a hyper-specific, fiercely analytical interpretation of a classical text today. Specifically, Allama Parwez's lecture on Surah As-Saaffat, Ayat 46 through 74.
Right.
Parwez takes a text that, for centuries has been sequestered in the realm of theology.
Basically read almost exclusively as a mystical allegory about the afterlife.
Exactly. And he reads it as this incredibly precise, empirical, socio-economic blueprint.
Which is a wild shift in perspective.
It is. He looks at this scene of the vindicated friend and asks a very grounded question, which is, what does vindication actually look and feel like from inside a functioning system?
Especially when that exact system was dismissed by your closest peers as, like, a utopian fantasy.
Right.
And that brings us to today's mission on this deep dive. We are setting out to deconstruct a radically different way of analyzing human civilization.
And our goal is to figure out how a text traditionally viewed through a purely spiritual lens might actually operate as a pragmatic, real-world manual.
A manual for economic and social survival. And I want to talk directly to you, the listener, right out of the gate here.
Yeah, put the ancient text aside for a second.
Just look at your own life. Think about your workplace or your industry or the political discourse you engage with. You have a vision for a structural change.
You point out that a current system is unsustainable.
And there's always that one friend, the persuasive realist.
The one who makes you feel incredibly naive for even suggesting that a logical, equitable system is possible.
Exactly. And what Parwez is doing is taking that micro-level, incredibly frustrating interaction and mapping it onto the rise and fall of entire civilizations.
Which is a massive leap in scale.
Huge.
And to justify that leap, Parwez has to perform a fundamental paradigm shift right at the beginning of his analysis.
He completely reframes the foundational architecture of this successful society, doesn't he?
He does. If you look at orthodox, traditional readings of this text readings that Parwez is very quick to point out, were largely codified during periods of absolute monarchy.
Eras he refers to as Mulukiyat, right?
Right, Mulukiyat. In those traditional readings, the inhabitants of this perfectly functioning society, this paradise, are rewarded with physical, sensual pleasures.
Right. The companions they sit with are described as hur.
Yes, a term that for hundreds of years has been universally translated as physical maidens.
But Parwez just rejects this entirely.
Completely bypasses it. He skips the medieval commentaries and goes straight back to the classical Arabic lexicons.
Like Edward William Lane's lexicon, for example.
Exactly. And he demonstrates that the root meaning of the word hur has absolutely nothing to do with physical beings.
It translates to pure and clean intellect.
Yes. It describes a human intellect that is entirely untainted by deception or falsehood or cognitive dissonance.
Okay, hold on. I need to push back here a little bit because this is a massive claim.
It's a huge claim.
Right, like for centuries, across multiple empires and scholarly traditions, hur has been translated as physical companions. And Parwez is just flipping that entirely to mean intellect.
I know, it sounds...
How does he justify that linguistically? Because the skeptical part of my brain is saying, isn't there a huge danger here of just retrofitting modern 20th century rationalism onto ancient texts?
That's a very fair point.
Like, it's very convenient to say, actually, the text agrees with my modern socioeconomic theories.
It is the necessary skeptical question, and it's one Parwez actually anticipates. He doesn't just assert this new definition out of nowhere. He grounds it in the etymological mechanics of the Arabic language itself. In classical Arabic, meaning is derived from root letters.
Right, the root system.
Yeah. The root for hur, HWR, relates to the stark contrast of stark white and deep black.
So it's about visual contrast.
It represents clarity, distinction, the ability to see things sharply and without any ambiguity.
Oh, okay.
In Bedouin poetry, which significantly predates the imperial eras, it described an eye that was brilliantly clear.
So he's taking that root concept of absolute clarity and mapping it to the mind.
Exactly. He shows how it applies to the human faculty of reason. When your intellect is hur, it means your ability to perceive reality is completely unclouded.
You can distinguish truth from falsehood with that same stark, contrasting clarity.
Precisely.
So the argument is that the text was originally talking about cognitive clarity, but later empires sort of twisted it.
That is exactly the argument. And this requires understanding the historical context of Mulukiyat, that authoritarian kingship we mentioned.
Right.
Put yourself in the shoes of a dynastic ruler centuries ago. You have a massive peasant class, immense wealth inequality, and a structural system built purely on exploitation.
The absolute last thing you want is a religious or social text promising the masses a society built on pure, unclouded intellect.
Exactly, because an unclouded intellect looks around, analyzes the ledger of cause and effect, and realizes the current system is deeply unjust.
They'd realize they're being scammed.
Yes, so how do you pacify them?
You promote interpretations of the text that promise sensual physical rewards in some distant future.
Right. A population focused on eventual physical indulgence is a population that isn't analyzing the structural inequalities of the present.
They are essentially sedated by the promise of luxury.
Sedated is the perfect word for it.
That is fascinating. So the rulers basically weaponized the translation to create an opiate for the masses.
Yes, they shifted the ultimate goal of human existence from intellectual perfection to endless physical consumption.
Wow. But Parwez is saying, look at the actual language of the text.
Right. When it describes this successful society, it says these companions, these pure intellects, are sitting face to face on couches.
Meaning there's no hierarchy.
Exactly. No one is sitting behind anyone else. It is a society of absolute equals, engaging with one another with crystal clear reasoning.
He also points to the text's use of the metaphor of the pearl and the oyster, right? The Maknoon.
Yeah, the Maknoon. Think about what an oyster actually does. In a turbulent, chaotic ocean of sediment and decay, the oyster takes the beating from the environment.
Right.
But it secretes layers to protect the grain of sand inside until it becomes a pearl.
And Parwez argues that pearl is the human personality, the pure intellect.
Yes. The successful society is one that acts as the oyster, protecting and cultivating that intellectual pearl, keeping it safe and uncorrupted by the chaos of exploitation.
Which completely flips the script. We are no longer talking about a magical realm of physical indulgence.
Not at all.
We are analyzing the blueprint of a hyper-rational, perfectly egalitarian society where the primary currency is cognitive clarity. But, and here is where this model usually falls apart in the real world, and where I struggle a bit to see how it sustains itself.
Okay, let's hear it.
In human history, every time a society achieves massive success, wealth, and abundance, it rots from the inside.
Historically, yes.
Wealth corrupts.
Yeah.
It makes people complacent. Look at any historical empire. The abundance eventually destroys the pure intellect of its founders.
It induces a kind of societal sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if this hypothetical society is in a state of absolute success and provision, how does it handle those resources without ruining the very intellect it is built on?
That is the exact pivot the text makes, and it brings us to one of the most brilliant socio-economic insights in Parwez's entire reading.
Okay.
The text doesn't ignore the concept of wealth or provision, it redefines its function.
How so?
The passage describes the companions in this functioning society drinking from a flowing cup. The drink is described as white and delicious to those who consume it.
But there's a catch.
A huge one. The defining structural characteristic of this drink is that it does not intoxicate.
The text is highly specific. It does not give them a headache, it does not exhaust them, and crucially, it does not diminish their senses or cloud their judgment.
And Parwez argues this is not a note about dietary habits.
No, it is a foundational macroeconomic principle. In a correctly functioning rational system, provision, meaning the wealth, the resources, the daily sustenance, the luxuries of life, it does not cloud human judgment, it empowers it.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of that because it sounds great in theory, but what does it actually mean? Like, how does a society engineer wealth so that it doesn't intoxicate?
Well, to understand how it works, we have to look at the contrast Parwez draws with those oppressive systems of Mulukiyat.
The monarchies.
Right. In his analysis, exploitative powers don't just incidentally create intoxicating pleasures as a byproduct of wealth.
They do it on purpose.
They actively design their provisions to intoxicate the masses. They want the population's intellect dulled.
Because a dull population is a compliant population. Exactly. Parwez uses the term perversion here, comparing it to a river that bursts its banks.
Okay, I like this analogy.
In a natural, balanced state, a river flows within its confines and provides life to the surrounding soil. But when it floods, it destroys the very crops it was meant to nourish.
Right.
In an oppressive system, the economic resources and cultural pleasures are designed to flood the senses, to overwhelm the intellect, so that no one questions the power structure.
If we elevate that analogy to a civilizational scale, it makes terrifying sense.
It really does.
And I don't want to just talk about the modern trope of, we're all addicted to our phones and fast food.
Relative cheaper.
Let's look at the macro structure of how economies function. Think about a nation that discovers massive oil reserves.
A classic petrostate scenario.
Exactly. Suddenly, there's an influx of incredible wealth, a flowing cup, right?
A very full cup.
But in many historical cases, that wealth becomes the resource curse. The ruling elite uses the massive profits to subsidize a very comfortable, cheap, consumer-heavy lifestyle for the citizens.
So there are no taxes. Gas is virtually free.
Basic goods are heavily subsidized. It feels delicious to the population. But functionally, it is an intoxicant.
Because the population no longer needs to innovate.
Right. They no longer need to build complex civic institutions, and they have absolutely no leverage to demand political representation because the state isn't relying on their tax dollars.
They're bought off.
The provision literally puts their civic and intellectual development to sleep. They are wealthy, but they're completely passive.
That is a perfect structural translation of Parwez's concept. The provision in your petrostate example is designed to sever the link between the citizen's intellect and the functioning of the state.
The citizen just becomes a consumer.
Not a contributor. They are intoxicated by the ease of the provision. Parwez argues that an exploitative society relies on this exact dynamic.
It needs its citizens slightly numb.
Yes, it needs them distracted by the constant influx of sensory or material gratification so they don't look at the ledger.
The rational accounting of how the society is actually structured, who holds the power, and who is being exploited behind the scenes.
Exactly. But to be clear, and I think we need to state this, we aren't endorsing any specific modern political framework here, just unpacking his sociological read of the text.
Right. We're just reporting on Parwez's analysis of structural mechanics. But wait, if that petrostate dynamic is the intoxicating cup, what does the non-intoxicating cup look like?
That's the million-dollar question.
If this successful society is still wealthy, still enjoying delicious provision, how does it avoid that trap? Is Parwez arguing for some sort of enlightened asceticism where people have wealth but just choose not to enjoy it?
Not at all. The text explicitly says the drink is delicious. It is meant to be enjoyed.
Okay.
The difference lies in the mechanism of acquisition and distribution. In Parwez's reading, the successful society is fundamentally egalitarian.
Right, the people sitting face to face.
Yes. The individuals sitting face to face have built this society through mutual effort and pure reason. The wealth they generate is a direct result of their aligned, rational labor.
So it's not an external windfall hoarding by an elite class.
Exactly. Therefore, when they consume the resources, it doesn't cause cognitive dissonance. It doesn't put them to sleep because their consumption is tied directly to their conscious structural maintenance of the society.
I see.
The provision acts as fuel for further intellectual and social growth, rather than a narcotic designed to induce passivity. The cup leaves their minds sharp, allowing them to remain fully present and engaged with one another as equals.
That reframes the entire concept of luxury. We are so deeply conditioned by history to believe that luxury and decadence are synonymous.
We assume that if a society gets too comfortable, it will inevitably decline.
Right. But Parwez is outlining a model where the resources of the society are channeled specifically to nourish human potential without corrupting it. The abundance doesn't create a ruling class and a dependent class. It creates an environment where the unclouded intellect, has the maximum amount of bandwidth to explore, philosophize, and advance.
You aren't exhausted by survival.
And you aren't intoxicated by cheap pleasure. You are, for the first time, fully awake.
And that profound state of being awake brings us to the inevitable, terrifying counter-scenario.
Because this is a text about a bifurcation point.
Exactly. If the reasoning mind helped build a society that sustains itself on provision, that empowers reason, what exactly is happening to the society built by the cynical friend?
The friend who mocked the rational ledger.
Right. Parwa's reading doesn't just theorize about success, it takes us on a brutal surgical tour of the failure.
And this is where the imagery of the text gets incredibly visceral, almost suffocating.
It really does.
We shift our focus from the society of pure intellect to the ruined society, which the text describes as the fire. And situated right in the dead center of this ruined civilization is the Zakum tree.
The infamous Zakum tree.
Right. The text tells us that the inhabitants of this society eat from this tree, and it completely fills their bellies. But then, to wash it down, they drink boiling water.
Here, Parwez shifts into a devastating critique of exploitative economics. He insists that the Zakum tree is not, a supernatural botanical punishment growing in some mystical underworld.
It's not just a scary story.
No, it is a precise metaphor for a civilization built entirely on exploitation, usurpation, and unsustainable extraction.
Oh.
Parwez points out that the text specifically identifies the architects of this system as the mutrafin.
The mutrafin. What does that mean in his vocabulary?
In Parwez's sociological vocabulary, the mutrafin are the elite class who hoard the resources, who monopolize the means of production, and who live lavishly off the labor of others.
Okay. So the Zakum tree isn't a punishment inflicted upon them from the outside.
No, the Zakum tree is the economy they have meticulously built. It is the architecture of their civilization.
Let me pause you there, because I want to make sure we are rigorously conveying Parwez's analysis without endorsing any specific modern political ideology.
Absolutely.
He is using this classical text to diagnose a specific mechanism of economic failure. He's saying the Zakum tree represents a system where wealth extraction by a few creates a toxic environment for the many.
Regardless of whether we call it feudalism, mercantilism, or crony capitalism.
Exactly. We are tracing his analytical framework.
Right. Parwez looks at the Zakum tree and sees an economy where the provision itself has become structurally hostile to human life.
The text compares the fruit of the tree to the heads of devils or serpents. Right?
Yes. It is inherently violent, bitter, and thorny. But here is the masterstroke of Parwez's analysis, the detail that reveals the true horror of this system.
Was that?
The text explicitly states that eating from the Zakum tree fills their bellies.
Yes. That is the conceptual paradox that forces you to completely rethink what societal failure looks like.
It completely flips your expectations.
When we, as modern listeners, picture a failed state or a ruined society, our minds immediately go to famine.
We picture empty grocery store shelves, bread lines.
People starving in the streets.
Right.
We associate societal collapse with an absolute lack of calories.
Right.
But Parwez is pointing out something far more insidious. He is describing a society where the people are full. Their bellies are completely stuffed.
You're consuming massive amounts of something.
Exactly.
This is the illusion of nourishment, and it is the defining characteristic of the Zakum economy.
The illusion of nourishment.
Right, because if you were an outside observer looking at the economic metrics of this society, everything might appear to be thriving.
The gross domestic product is likely soaring.
Supply chains are moving at breakneck speed. Consumption levels are off the charts. The people are constantly buying, eating, and interacting with the market.
They are undeniably full.
But, and this is Parwez's core insight, there is absolutely no human development taking place.
How does he prove that from the text?
He proves this by analyzing the Arabic word used for this ruined society, jahim.
Jahim.
Traditional theology translates jahim simply as hell, but linguistically, Parwez notes that the root of jahim literally means a place where growth, movement, and evolution abruptly stop.
Stop completely.
Yes. It describes a scenario where a flowing river hits a blockage, The water stops moving and it stagnates, eventually becoming toxic.
So they are eating, but they aren't growing.
Exactly.
The economy is moving, but humanity is stagnating. I really want to break down the mechanics of how a system manages to fill your belly while simultaneously choking you, because that is a very specific type of torture.
To understand the mechanics, Parwez cross-references other parts of the text that describe the food of this exploitative system as tamun zagusa.
Tamun zagusa. What does that translate to?
It translates to a food that chokes. It is sustenance that gets lodged in the throat. You can neither swallow it down to gain nourishment nor spit it out to relieve the pain.
That sounds horrific.
It is. Parwez describes this food as the discarded remnants, the chewed-up bones and scraps left behind by the mutrafine.
The elites.
Right. It provides zero actual vitality or energy. It only provides fatigue, weariness, and the sensation of being bloated.
If we translate tamun zagusa into modern structural terms, the analogies are everywhere, and they are grim.
They really are. Give me an example.
Think about an economy built entirely on debt and planned obsolescence.
Oh, absolutely.
You have a population working 60, 70 hours a week. They are absolutely exhausted. With the money they earn, they buy cheap, mass-produced goods that are designed to break within a year.
Forcing them to buy them all over again.
Exactly. They take out mortgages. They can barely afford to live in suburbs that require them to buy cars they must finance just to commute to the jobs that exhaust them.
It's a closed loop.
They are consuming at a massive rate. Their houses are full of things. Their bellies are full of hyper-processed, calorically dense but nutritionally void food.
But they are choking.
They are choking. The very act of participating in the economy, the very act of eating the zakum fruit, induces immense stress, anxiety, and stagnation.
They have no time, energy, or cognitive bandwidth.
No whore.
Right. No who are left to evolve as human beings, to build communities, or to engage in the pure intellect. The provision itself is the prison.
And that is a terrifying realization.
That is exactly the dynamic Parwez is isolating. The system is designed to keep you on a treadmill of frantic consumption that yields zero developmental progress.
You are merely sustaining your own exhaustion.
Yes, and the mechanism that ultimately seals this closed loop of toxicity is the drink.
The boiling water.
Remember, in the successful society, the pure intellects drink from a flowing cup that leaves their minds sharp and empowered.
Right.
In the Zakum society, after filling their bellies with this choking, exhausting food, the text says they are given boiling water to drink.
Which is such a striking contrast.
Parwez points out a profound irony here. Water, in its natural state, is the fundamental prerequisite for life. It is the catalyst for growth. When water flows, civilization flourishes.
Of course.
But in this society, the water is boiling. If you pour boiling water onto a seed or a plant, you do not nourish it, you kill it instantly.
You literally destroy its cellular potential.
You destroy it. So the very resources that are supposed to foster life have been weaponized.
Yes. In the Zakum economy, the institutions, the resources, and the systems that theoretically exist to protect and nurture human potential are fundamentally corrupted by the exploitative structure.
They become the boiling water.
Instead of fostering life, they actively scald and destroy the human personality. Let's ground that in reality. What does boiling water look like structurally?
I'm curious to hear your take on this.
It looks like a healthcare system that financially ruins a family when someone gets sick, turning the institution of healing into an engine of poverty.
That's a powerful example.
Or it looks like an educational system that saddles young minds with decades of inescapable debt, turning the pursuit of knowledge into a financial trap that limits their future choices.
The resource health education is still being delivered.
But it is boiling. It destroys the potential of the citizen even as they consume it. It is a completely devastating portrait of systemic failure.
You have a full belly, a choking throat, and boiling water actively destroying whatever latent human potential you have left.
Then crucially, Parwez emphasizes that this isn't an external punishment handed down by an angry deity.
Right, this is not supernatural retribution.
It is the logical, inevitable, mathematical result of the economic machine they built themselves.
When you build a society on usurpation rather than rational equity, the resulting infrastructure will inevitably reflect that violence.
The Zakum tree is just the ledger balancing itself.
Exactly, the ledger balances itself.
But this brings us to the most urgent, baffling question of this entire deep dive. If this Zakum system is so obviously toxic, if it is so clearly exhausting, choking, and stagnant, why would anyone choose it?
Right.
When that society was at its bifurcation point, Why did the majority of the community look at the rational ledger, reject it, and walk willingly into the Jahim?
To understand that, we have to pull the camera back from the macroeconomics and return to the deeply personal relationship between the two friends.
The vindicated friend and the cynic.
This is where Parwez's analysis transitions from sociology into a profound autopsy of human psychology.
Okay.
The narrative in the text shifts perspective. We are back with the vindicated speaker, the one who committed to the rational ledger, sitting in the society of pure intellect.
He looks down, he has a vantage point of clarity now, and he peers into the Jahim.
And right there, in the dead center of the ruined, stagnating Zakum society, he sees his old companion,
The friend who mocked him.
the persuasive realist. And the vindicated speaker declares, "By God, you nearly destroyed me. Had it not been for the grace of my Lord, I would be right there with you."
You nearly destroyed me. I want to linger on that sentence because it completely shatters our conventional understanding of how societies collapse.
Yeah, it really does.
When we think of historical villains, the people responsible for civilizational ruin, we think of despots. We think of armies marching across borders, brutal dictators forcing people into submission at the point of a sword.
But that is not what is happening here.
No, it isn't.
And Parwez highlights this as a brilliant psychological insight within the text. The companion who denied the rational ledger, the one who championed the system that eventually grew into the Zakum tree, he was not a tyrant.
Right.
He had no military. He wasn't uniquely, overtly evil in a way that would trigger immediate alarm bells. He was just highly, highly persuasive.
He possessed social capital.
Exactly. He possessed social capital.
He was the guy at the dinner party making the witty, cynical jokes.
Yes.
He was the one rolling his eyes when you brought up the need for systemic fairness. He was the charismatic peer who knows exactly how to use a smirk and a sarcastic comment to make you feel embarrassed for caring so much.
He wielded irony as a weapon against earnestness.
That's beautifully put. Irony as a weapon.
The existential danger to the rational society wasn't military force. It was rhetoric. It was the social friction of peer pressure.
And Parwez asks the critical question. How is this denier so devastatingly persuasive?
How did he manage to convince an entire community to abandon a logical, equitable model and walk willingly into an architecture of exploitation?
What's the answer?
The answer Parwez uncovers in the text is the concept of taqlid.
Taqlid.
Blind tradition, conformity to the past.
We need to spend serious time unpacking taqlid because this feels like the absolute linchpin of the whole tragedy.
It is the linchpin.
How does blind tradition function as the bridge between a functioning community and the Zakum tree?
When the text describes the inhabitants of the ruined society, they are essentially asked how they ended up in the Jahim.
And what do they say?
Their answer is chilling precisely because it is so banal. They don't claim they were conquered. They don't claim they made a calculated risk that failed. They admit quite openly that they simply didn't use their reason. They didn't analyze the data of their reality. They state that they found their ancestors on a certain path and they were just running in their exact footsteps.
Literally just running blindly.
Parwez analyzes the specific Arabic phrasing used here. They weren't just walking casually. They were hurrying blindly in the tracks of the past.
So the persuasive friend didn't have to invent a brilliant new philosophical logic to convince people to build the Zakum economy.
No, not at all.
He just had to appeal to the profound psychological comfort of the status quo.
Exactly.
He just had to say, look, this is how we've always done it. This is how the market works. This is human nature. Don't overthink it. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Just keep your head down and follow the path.
Yes. And evolutionary psychology actually backs up the power of this persuasion.
How so?
Human beings are deeply hardwired for social conformity. Standing out, challenging the tribe, demanding that everyone stop and examine the rational ledger that requires massive amounts of cognitive and social energy.
It risks ostracization.
Taqlid, simply following the footprints of the ancestors, is calorically and socially cheap. It feels safe.
So the cynical friend was offering them the path of least resistance.
He was saying, why endure the stress of trying to build this pure intellect society when you can just relax, conform, and enjoy the way things are?
But the horrifying reality is that they were so comforted by the familiarity of the footprints, they never stopped to look up and realize the path was leading directly off a cliff.
They were sleepwalking into the Jahim.
This is the insight I want everyone listening to internalize. The greatest threat to your intellectual survival and by extension, our collective social survival, usually isn't a demagogue screaming from a podium.
You can see a demagogue coming.
Exactly. You can build defenses against overt tyranny. The real threat is the charismatic peer sitting next to you.
It's the colleague, the friend, the popular influencer who normalizes the toxic system.
It's the voice that weaponizes the comfort of tradition against the hard, exhausting work of reason. And what Parwez is forcing us to confront is the true cost of that social dynamic.
And that cost is absolute.
The cost of listening to that persuasive friend, the friend who happens to be structurally, fundamentally wrong about the mechanics of reality, is nothing less than total civilizational ruin.
You end up spending your life eating the choking fruit of the zakum tree simply because you didn't want to look uncool or naive at the dinner party.
That is the quiet tragedy at the heart of the text.
The persuasion works because utilizing the horror, unclouded intellect is difficult. It demands constant vigilance.
It requires looking at the unvarnished ledger of cause and effect and making difficult, often unpopular choices.
Blindly following tradition requires no effort at all. You just put one foot in front of the other, tracing the steps of those who came before you, until you find yourself fully entrenched in the jahim, the place where all human growth stops.
And when the vindicated friend looks down and says, "You nearly destroyed me," it is a profound acknowledgement of vulnerability.
He felt the gravitational pull of that mockery.
He felt the deep, exhausting temptation to just give up, go along with the crowd, and be accepted by his peer.
He realizes how incredibly fragile rational thought is when subjected to the relentless pressure of cynical conformity.
It's a moment of terrifying self-awareness.
Yeah.
He isn't gloating. He isn't saying, "I was always smarter than you."
He's saying, I survived you by the skin of my teeth.
Precisely. And if we pull all of these threads together, Parwez's reading of Surah As-Saaffat reveals itself as the ultimate autopsy of a societal bifurcation point.
We started with two minds embedded in the exact same community.
They face the exact same data, the exact same historical moment, the exact same economic pressures.
One chose the path of pure reason. Parwez introduces the Arabic term mukhlas here.
Mukhlas, what does that signify?
It describes something pure, unadulterated, a clear intellect that fiercely refuses to be clouded by tradition or immediate gratification.
And that choice, the grueling commitment to the rational ledger, led to the construction of an egalitarian society.
A society where provision and wealth empower human growth rather than intoxicating it.
Where equals sit face to face, unclouded and fully awake.
And the other path.
The other chose the path of mockery, cynicism, and blind tradition.
Parwez uses the term shab for this, which means adulterated, mixed, toxic thinking. It is an intellect compromised by the desire for conformity.
And that choice inevitably built an exploitative zakum economy.
An economy managed by the mutrafin, which successfully filled the bellies of its population with choking food.
But ultimately stagnated their evolution and destroyed their latent potential with the boiling water of corrupted institutions.
This passage, viewed through Parwez's analytical lens, captures the precise moment the historical dust settles.
It is the moment it becomes empirically, undeniably clear which internal choice led to which external reality.
It is an absolutely overwhelming framework to view the world through.
It really is. It takes concepts we usually relegate to abstract philosophy, reason versus tradition, equity versus exploitation, and renders them with the terrifying clarity of a mathematical equation.
Actions have structural consequences.
The ledger always balances, and I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering challenge based on the depths of Parwez's analysis today.
Something to really sit with.
I want you to look around your own life. Think about the companions whose voices you allow to influence you.
Think about the societal systems, the workplace cultures, the economic habits you find yourself defending or simply participating in without question.
Are you running blindly in the footsteps of the past just because it's comfortable? Just because the cynical voices around you make it embarrassing to demand something better?
Look really closely at the cup you are drinking from every single day.
Look at the media you consume, the economic structures you rely on to feel secure, the culture you participate in to feel normal. Ask yourself, is this provision actually sharpening my intellect?
Is it empowering my reason?
Or is it a perfectly designed zakum tree, keeping my belly full, keeping me passive, and keeping me entirely asleep?